Welcome back. This video, we want to talk about the difference between primary and secondary sources. The reason for that is, for your research project, you need to use a variety of sources. Criteria B, Strand 3, asks you to collect and record relevant information consistent with the research question. And so relevant information will come from both primary and secondary sources. For criteria D, strand 4, you need to identify and analyze a range of sources and data in terms of origin and purpose. And so we'll look at later how to analyze your sources, but we need a range of sources, which means using primary and secondary sources. So first, primary sources are the original sources of information recorded at the time an event occurred. So published materials can be viewed as primary sources if they come from the time period that's being discussed and were written or produced by someone with firsthand experience of the event. Right? And we'll look at some examples later. So they can also be written much later than the events if they were written by a person who was there. So memoirs, diaries, oral histories, and recorded interviews can all be primary sources. So since we're using a variety of sources, primary and secondary, what's the purpose of using primary sources? Why should we? They help explain how major events are related to each other in time. They helps you to think critically and distinguish between fact and opinion because you're getting the story right from the person. So you need to think critically about what is their opinion and are they telling facts, and how to analyze those we'll talk about later. And it helps you to recognize a point of view in print and visual materials. We'll look at an example again in a little bit. They allow you to develop your own conclusions and analyze how historical events affect life, and they help you to recognize failures and successes in the past in order to make better decisions as a person. So let's look at some examples. Here we have the Declaration of Independence from the United States. Some other examples would be diaries, poetry, government documents, autobiographies. Oral evidence, so stories being passed down from person to person, or from those who have been eyewitness to events. So again, primary source, as long as the person was there or the document was written at the time, it can be considered a primary source. Photographs are another good example of a primary source. So are artifacts. Baseball cards, photos, cartoons can all be examples of primary sources if you are studying those things. Right, so for example, with baseball cards or sports cards or any kind of cards, maybe if you're researching uh, how have sporting cards changed over time, this would be an example of a primary source. Right? Photos. If you're studying what an area looked or how things were at a certain time, a photograph can help. Same with political cartoons. Right, so here's a list of things that can be considered primary sources. The most important is that they're original works from the time period or from the event happening. So if you want, you can pause, you can take a picture or write these down in your notes. You do not need to memorize the list of what are primary sources because, as we'll see later, many resources can be considered primary or secondary sources depending on how and why they're used. Right? So you don't need to memorize this list. While you're doing your research into your research question, one way to help you find primary sources is to just type in your topic plus primary source and see what comes up. The second type we want to look at are secondary sources. So secondary sources of information come from primary sources. They're mainly, they can be summaries or analysis of primary sources. So why use them? We looked at why do we use primary sources, so why would we use secondary sources then? One reason is to get expert opinions in order to evaluate what really happened. So if we're studying some event in history, we might not know a lot about it. So if we look at one of the primary sources, we might not really understand the context or what the picture or the diary is or what it's saying. So if we look at what an expert has already said, an expert historian has already said about those, it can help us give a better idea of what happened. We can also understand things from different perspectives. Right? So if we look at one picture, we might have an idea of what it is, but then we can look at other secondary sources of what have other people said or how have other people interpreted this picture. Right? So we might get ideas that we hadn't originally thought of. And then from those, we can form our own opinion. It can also help us save time by reading information collected from a number of different sources. Right? So if we look at if we're looking for primary sources of photographs of some event, if we look in a textbook or some other book about that, they likely already have a lot of the primary sources gathered. So it'll save us time looking for things. So some main examples of secondary sources would be dictionaries, encyclopedias, articles that review other sources, textbooks, biographies, things like that. All right, let's look at some examples, and you can try and decide with your group, is it a primary or a secondary source? So high school students using this document to study the handwriting of people living in the 1700s. Would that be a primary or a secondary source? All right, that's a primary source because we can assume, although the date's not written here, that this was in the 1700s. So this is an example of somebody writing at the time period that we're researching. All right, this is a textbook, and it's being used to write a report about the history of India, China, and Southeast Asia. Would that be a primary or a secondary source? All right, that would be a secondary source. Inside this book, they have many primary sources that we're looking at, but the information in the book is a summary or somebody else's analysis and interpretation of the events. Right? So even though it contains primary sources, this book as a whole is a secondary source. All right, what about this photograph used to research the language of Native Americans? You see a man, looks like recording a Native American man speaking or singing or doing something. Would this be a primary or secondary source? All right, if we can analyze this picture and find that it's a real picture and it's authentic, we would say it's a primary source, right? Because it's a picture taken at the time that it was happening. All right, these things you could call the group of them memorabilia, right? They're people's personal belongings. So you see an old watch, a couple photographs, some sort of a receipt or a train ticket. Would these be primary or secondary sources? Right, these would likely be primary sources. Here's an autobiography of David Beckham, the soccer player. Would this be a primary or secondary source? Right. I would say this would be a primary source. If you're studying David Beckham, you're getting information directly from him. All right, here's a cartoon or a meme. Would you consider this to be a primary or a secondary source in research? So I think if you're researching what did memes or political cartoons look like in the early 2000s, this would be a primary source because it's an example that was written during the time period that you're studying. Again, primary or secondary source. This would likely be a primary source of if you're studying ancient currency, ancient money. All right, the movie Despicable Me or Minions, whichever one this is it a primary or secondary source? Again, I think this depends on what it is that you're researching. If you're researching what did DreamWorks movies look like at this time period, this would be a primary source because it's an example that was made during that time. So let's start summing up here. So remember, what a source is depends on how it's being used. For example, a textbook is usually considered a secondary source, right? However, if you are somebody who is studying what kind of information was in textbooks in 1993, those textbooks then become a primary source. And we can talk about that more in class. Later on, right? So both primary and secondary sources have their advantages and disadvantages. Both of them might have a bias, and we'll talk about that in a later video. So when you're analyzing your sources, you need to look at them both critically to see if they're promoting a particular point of view or showing both sides of an issue. Right? So for example, in an autobiography, like the autobiography of David Beckham, it's likely biased to only talk about the positive things about his life or the positive things about him. Right? Bias can also show up on what is left out by as much as what is left in, and we'll talk about bias when we look next time at evaluating our sources. Right? So summing up this whole thing, it's important to determine the type of information you're looking at, whether it's a primary or secondary source. Primary sources are original sources of information that were made by people who were there or made during that time period, whereas secondary sources generally summarize, analyze, or interpret or critique primary sources. They can both be good sources of information, and you need to use both types in your research project, but you also need to critically analyze and evaluate them,